and were mown down by German machine gunners at something like half a mile range. It demonstrates the degree of confusion which exists on any battlefield, but also the lethal power of the weaponry in use on the Somme, above all, the machine gun. The British called it a Vickers gun, the Germans a Spandau, but both were only minor variations on the Maxim gun, invented by the American Hiram Maxim. A working Vickers gun is now incredibly rare, but the British Army has one. Apart from bullets, the most important bit of kit is water for the barrel's cooling jacket. It quickly boils, turns to steam, and is recycled via this hose. 100 yards for this weapon is point-blank range.
Do you want to go, sir?
The rate of fire is 500 rounds a minute.
Lift the check levers in your own time.
So despite what you hear, is discharging around 9 bullets per second.
And again.
When you see this gun being fired in the movies, you often see them firing it looking like that and firing tiny little short bursts. That's quite wrong. The proper way to fire this gun is looking over the top and looking at the fall of shot, if you can see it, because you may be firing at ranges beyond which you can see. Shooting off a map, i.e. getting a map, working out where the target is, taking a bearing to it, and laying the gun along that bearing. I was taught on this gun, because it was still in service when I was a young officer. You lift the lever, press the firing button, and you count 1 banana, 2 banana, 3 banana, 4, which gives you a 4-second burst. You then hit it like that, and you're trained to do it, so you knock the gun off half a degree. Why? Because you're covering what is known as the beaten zone in that way. And you do it again after the next burst, and then back again. You can see how close together that fall of shot is on this target. This is because when I was firing, I was only 100 yards away. At about 1.5 miles, that would spread out and produce this banana-shaped beaten zone, much bigger than this target here. 2 or 4 or 8 or 10 guns firing together will cover a huge beaten zone with interlocking zones of fire, which is why this gun was such a lethal weapon.
The Germans will certainly have mapped out where the British would attack from months in advance and simply fired on those bearings on July the 1st. Because of the weapon's range, most machine gunners on both sides never even saw the men they were killing. The men who died never knew who was firing at them.
Given that both sides are essentially using the same sort of kit, and the only way you can defeat an enemy is capturing the ground that he's sitting on, that means that you have to cross open ground. And the way to do that without losing casualties will not come along for another 40 years, when eventually an armoured personnel carrier is produced. We don't have that in 1916. We don't have any means of protecting the soldier from the time our own artillery barrage lifts to our man getting into the enemy trench. That's the bit of ground that he's got to cover. He's got nothing to cover him. You're going to have casualties.
How much did the generals actually know about what was happening once the troops disappeared over the top?
In the Falklands, I was in constant touch with the units forward, as well as those further back, providing fire support, either artillery or aircraft. Nowadays, it's not uncommon for a general to be watching live video pictures relayed from the battle area.
Here, communications were unbelievably primitive by modern standards.
It's the only war where the commander cannot influence what is happening in real time by his voice. In previous wars, he could see what happens. In future wars, he's got a radio which gives him information in real time. He doesn't have that this time. And the main means of communication is by telephone. Just for the Somme alone, they lay something like 50,000 miles of telephone cable. I mean, that's nearly twice around the world. Huge numbers.
Beyond the front line, the telephone was virtually useless. Troops would trail wires behind them, but they were quickly severed by shell fire. The defenders didn't have that problem, so they could order up an artillery strike or reinforcements in an instant. As quaint as it sounds, the assault forces relied on carrier pigeons. Thousands of birds were held ready in mobile pigeon lofts like this. Just how primitive communications were is revealed by these pictures of men about to attack with something strange on their backs.
This rather odd tin triangle, every soldier in the 8th Corps had them. It's a piece of tin from a ration tin, and this will glitter, showing observers watching from the rear how far forward you've got. Remember, there's no telephones that you can take easily, and certainly no radios. This is very important to avoid being targeted by your own artillery.
The death toll on the Somme was so high because the technology of killing had far outstripped the technology of communication. I wonder how well commanders would have performed in the Second World War, or indeed today, if their communication was still by pigeon post. What was the position as the first day of the battle drew to a close? In the southern sector, the British and French had advanced up to 1.5 miles, achieving many of their objectives. Further north, the picture was more bleak, with only very limited advances here, north of Thiepval. Almost 20,000 deaths made this the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. And this was just the beginning. It's sometimes forgotten that the Somme wasn't a one-day battle, but a 4-month campaign, lasting until November. The carnage of day one was never repeated, but the casualties rose remorselessly. Much of the fighting centred on the frontline villages, which were quickly reduced to nothing more than rubble. Here at Pozières, the Australian 1st, 2nd and 4th Divisions were engaged in the most bitter combat. They took the village with vicious hand-to-hand fighting among the ruined houses and cellars. In seizing Pozières, crucial as the highest vantage point on the whole battlefield, the Australians were to lose 23,000 men in 6 weeks, almost as many as fell at Gallipoli over 8 months. Everywhere, the Germans held the advantage of the defender, inside their dugouts and concrete bunkers like these. Faced with staggering losses for so little gain, should Haig have called a halt? Even if he'd wished to shut the battle down, such a decision wouldn't have been sanctioned by the French or indeed the British cabinet. And although the Allies weren't to know it at first, the battle had very quickly achieved its key strategic objective. On July the 12th, the German High Command called off the offensive at Verdun and rushed troops to deal with a new crisis on the Somme. From this point on, Verdun became a story of German retreat and French advance. The French wouldn't be knocked out of the war. But as summer turned to autumn, was there anything Haig could do to deliver a knockout blow on the Somme? Although he's sometimes been portrayed as a hidebound ex-cavalry officer, he championed Britain's revolutionary secret weapon. So secret that it had to be shipped to the front in giant sealed wooden boxes, labelled water tanks.
The name stuck. The tank made its world debut on the field of battle here in and around the village of Fleur on September the 15th.
Haig had asked for 150 tanks to be ready for day one of the Somme. If they had been, the results might have been very much different. As it was, 49 tanks were delivered in mid-September. Top speed was 3.7 miles an hour, not much more than walking pace. They were so noisy inside that the commander and his 7 crew had to use hand signals. The crew risked serious injury just from the way they lurched around, and the armour was so thin that even machine gun bullets could do serious damage. But for crushing barbed wire, providing an element of cover for the infantry, and simply demoralising the enemy, they proved very effective.
At Fleur, terrified Germans surrendered in large numbers as the lumbering monsters arrived. A highly coloured account appeared in the British press. A tank is walking up the high street of Fleur with the British Army cheering behind. Haig immediately placed an order for another 1,000 tanks to be delivered as soon as possible.
The tank is first used on the Battle of the Somme. It has some psychological effect on the Germans, but most of the initial batch that were used broke down, were knocked out, went on fire, got into shell holes and couldn't get out again. But people could see the potential. Taking the lessons of the use of tanks on the Somme, as time goes on, they get better and better and better. By 1917, they're quite useful. By the end of the war, the British are very good at the use of tanks.
As winter approached, heavy rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire. But the fighting continued. The last major attacks were mounted in October and November.
It's remarkable to note that Beaumont Hamel was one of the objectives marked down for capture on the first day of the battle. It was finally taken by the 51st Highland Division on November the 14th. July the 1st seemed a very long time ago.
The Battle of the Somme officially ended on November the 19th. The actual advance made by the Allies amounted to 9 miles at its deepest. But it's crucial to understand that winning ground wasn't the main aim of this battle. Haig's final dispatch reflects his orders that keeping France in the war was the real task.
So, who won the Battle of the Somme? An officer of the German Guard Reserve Division said, "The Somme was the muddy grave of the German army." I agree with him.
It's a striking phrase which sums up the brutal arithmetic of this terrible battle. British and Dominion casualties total 420,000, of whom 127,000 were killed. French losses were 200,000, killed, missing and wounded. Estimates of German losses vary between 500 and 600,000. Despite holding all the advantages of defence over attack, their losses were almost as great as the Allies. And this proved crucial to the outcome of the war.